The Grand Conclave Hall of the Galaxy Council was one of the most beautiful places in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of Nexus Station Aurelian, a massive space station that floated between three star systems like a jewel hanging in the dark. The hall had a ceiling so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and its walls were made of a special crystal that changed color depending on which species was speaking. It had taken 400 years and the combined effort of 31 civilizations to build it. It was meant to be a symbol of unity. On this particular day, it was a symbol of nothing but noise. Ambassador Vrethka of the Sylvani hegemony stood at the central podium, her four arms spread wide as she made her case for expanding the Sylvani trade borders into the Myerden corridor. She had been speaking for nearly 2 hours. Her voice was smooth and practiced, each word chosen like a piece in a puzzle. The hall was full. 47 species sat in their delegations, some listening, some whispering to their aides, some eating quietly from small containers of their native food. It was a normal session. Loud, messy, political, and very, very long. Then a young aide named Thesic, barely 3 years out of the Sylvani Academy, tugged on Vrethka's lower sleeve. Vrethka ignored him. He tugged again. She turned her head slightly and gave him the look that all senior ambassadors give junior aides when they are being interrupted, the look that means this had better be important. Thesic pointed. Vrethka followed his gesture across the vast floor of the hall, past the Korathi block with their thick gray shells, past the Lu delegation wrapped in their soft luminescent robes, past the Velkari archivist sitting perfectly still as always, and she saw it. The human section was empty. All 12 chairs, every single one, no ambassadors, no aides, no junior staff standing along the back wall. Not even the 2 human security officers who usually stood quietly near the entrance to their section. Just 12 empty chairs and a small table with 12 untouched glasses of water. Vrethka stopped speaking mid-sentence. The hall, one by one, went quiet. It was not the kind of quiet that falls when something dramatic happens. It was the slower, stranger kind. The kind that spreads like a cold wind moving through a crowd, touching one person at a time until everyone feels it without quite knowing why. Council Speaker Orath Vel, a tall Korathi elder with a shell the color of old copper, leaned forward from his elevated seat at the head of the hall. His compound eyes swept across the human section. He made a sound that translated roughly as mild irritation. "Where are the human delegates?" he asked. No one answered, because no one knew. Thesic had already pulled out his data tablet and was moving his thin fingers quickly across the surface. He found what he was looking for, and his face did something that Vrethka had never seen it do before. It went completely still. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "the human embassy on level 7 is sealed, lights off, doors locked. Their communication channel has been redirected to an automated response." Vrethka stared at him. "What does the automated response say?" Thesic read from his screen. "Thank you for contacting the human diplomatic mission. This channel is no longer active. We wish the Council and all its member species peace and prosperity. Take care of each other." The hall was very quiet now. Speaker Orathvel made another sound, this one harder to translate. It was somewhere between confusion and offense. He turned to his chief aide and spoke in a low voice, and the aide immediately began working, reaching out to human channels, human contacts, human outposts in the area. The results came back one by one, and with each result the aide's expression became more uncomfortable. Every human diplomatic office on the station was dark. The human residential levels were empty, not abandoned in a messy way, not like people who had fled in a hurry. They were clean, orderly. Every room was left neat, every shared community space was swept and organized. Personal items were gone. The humans had packed their things and left in an organized, quiet, deliberate way, like people who had decided something a long time ago and had simply been waiting for the right moment to act on it. No declaration of war, No farewell speech. No list of grievances posted on the council's notice boards. No dramatic exit through the main hall while everyone watched. They had simply gone. While everyone else was sleeping, or eating, or arguing about trade routes, the humans had packed up and walked out. 1 week passed, then another. The council sent messages to human colonies, to human home systems, to every human-registered vessel in the shipping lanes. Most messages were met with the same polite automated response. The few that got through to actual humans were answered briefly and without hostility. Yes, humanity had withdrawn from the council. No, they would not be sending delegates back. No, this was not a declaration of war. No, they did not wish to discuss it further at this time. The initial reaction in the council was, to put it plainly, not very worried. The Korathi High Speaker gave a brief public statement calling humanity's departure a political overreaction from an emotionally unstable species. Several Sylvani commentators wrote long pieces about how humans had always been too loud, too sentimental, too obsessed with causes that did not concern them. The galaxy, many agreed, would probably be a quieter and more efficient place without them. There were a few dissenting voices. A loose scientist named Pip, young and soft-spoken, told her colleagues that she thought humanity leaving was worth taking seriously. She had studied alongside human scientists at a joint academy for 6 years. She knew them. She said that humans did not do things without thinking them through. Her colleagues listened politely and then went back to their work. And then there was Sareth 9. Sareth 9 was a Velkari archivist, which meant his entire life was dedicated to one thing: remembering. The Velkari were the oldest species in the council. They did not fight wars. They did not build empires. They observed. They recorded. They remembered. Sareth 9 was considered old even by Velkari standards, and he had been in the council archives for so long that some of the junior staff believed he had always been there, like the furniture. On the evening after the human chairs were found empty, Sareth 9 did not go to his rest cycle. He sat in the archive room, in the dim blue light that the Velkari found comfortable, and he pulled up records. He went back 50 years, then 100, then 200. He moved slowly and carefully the way he always did, because Sareth 9 believed that rushing through information was the same as not reading it at all. What he found was not dramatic. There were no secret files, no hidden messages. It was all sitting there in the open records where anyone could have looked. The problem was that no one had thought to look, not all at once, not in the right way. He found the name of a human engineer on the original design team for the Myerton Corridor hyperspace lane. Then another human name on the maintenance protocol update from 40 years ago. Then 3 more on the emergency repair mission that had kept the corridor open during the solar disruption event of 2287. He found human signatures on the universal translation matrix, not just as contributors, but as the primary architects. He found human medical teams listed in the footnotes of the report on the Shriven Plague containment. Footnotes, the kind no one read. He found a human diplomat's name buried in the appendix of the Sylvani Draft peace agreement, not as a credited mediator, as a supporting party, as if 40 years of careful, patient relationship building between two species who despised each other was worth an appendix mention. Sareth 9 sat with all of this for a long time. He did not go to the council with what he had found. Not yet. It was too early. The pattern was clear to him, but patterns required proof, and proof required time. He saved his files carefully, labeled them with the Velkari notation for urgent but not yet ready, and closed his screen. He sat in the dark archive room for a while longer, very still, the way his kind always sat when they were troubled. Then he whispered something to himself. He whispered it in the old Velkari language, the one they only used for things that mattered deeply. Translated into the common tongue of the council, it meant something close to this. We did not see them. We looked at them every day, and we did not see them at all. Outside the archive room, through the thick walls of the station, the galaxy went on as normal. Ships moved through their lanes. Delegates argued in their halls. Species went about their days, comfortable in the belief that nothing important had changed. The chairs stayed empty. And somewhere, far out beyond the council's reach, the humans were already building something new. The first year without the humans was, by most accounts in the council records, described as smooth. Motions that had been stuck for years suddenly passed without trouble. The Sylvani got their trade expansion in the Myrdin corridor. The Korathi pushed through a new border militarization bill that humanity had blocked 3 times before. 2 smaller species lost their protected status under the Council's welfare charter, a measure that humans had fought loudly and stubbornly against for decades. Without them in the room, the vote took less than an hour. Several senior delegates described the change as refreshing. One Korathi official was quoted in a council press release saying that the sessions had become productive and dignified. What he meant, though he did not say it so plainly, was that no one was standing up anymore to complain about the things everyone else preferred to ignore. Thesic, the young Sylvani aide, read that press release in his small office on level 4 and felt something uncomfortable settle in his stomach. He could not explain it. He filed the feeling away and went back to his work. The second year was when things started getting strange. It began with the Myrdin corridor. The hyperspace lane that the Sylvani had just won the rights to expand was built on a system of automated relay stations that managed the gravitational alignment of the route. Without that alignment, ships traveling through the corridor could get pulled slightly off course, not enough to be immediately dangerous, but enough to add days to a journey, and in the worst cases, enough to push a vessel into the edge of the Veth Nebula, which was not a place any ship wanted to be. The relay stations had been maintained for decades by a rotating team of engineers. When the assignment roster was reviewed after the humans left, the council discovered something awkward. 11 of the 17 engineers on that rotating team had been human. The 6 remaining were from 4 different species, and none of them had been trained on the full maintenance system, only on their specific section of it. The humans had understood the whole thing, the way it was connected, the way each part talked to the others. The remaining 6 engineers understood their own piece the way someone understands one room in a house without knowing where the walls or the foundation are. The relay stations began to drift. Not quickly, not in a way anyone noticed right away, but over 18 months the alignment shifted by small degrees in 14 different stations, and the Myrdin corridor became unreliable. Ships arrived late. 2 cargo vessels took wrong turns and spent weeks lost in the outer edges of the nebula before rescue teams found them. Trade through the corridor dropped by 30%. The Sylvani, who had just expanded their rights to the very route now causing them problems, were not pleased. A full engineering team was sent to assess the situation. They came back with a report that was technically detailed, professionally written, and essentially useless, because what it concluded was that the system was built in a way that required a very specific kind of understanding to maintain, and that understanding had left with the humans. The Korathi High Speaker called it an infrastructure failure. He was not wrong, but he did not ask the next obvious question, which was, who had been preventing this infrastructure failure for the past 60 years? Then the famine came. Cathari Prime was not a rich world. It was small, dry, and its soil was difficult to grow food in. The Cathari people had been council members for 80 years, but had always depended heavily on imported food supplies and agricultural assistance from other species. For most of those 80 years, that assistance had arrived consistently, in the right amounts, with the right nutrient composition suited to Cathari biology. It had arrived because a rotating team of human agricultural science vessels had made Cathari Prime part of their regular circuit, quietly and without fanfare. When those vessels stopped coming, no one reassigned the circuit. It was not done out of cruelty. It was done out of the same quiet assumption that keeps disasters from being prevented, the assumption that someone else is handling it. By the time the Council's Relief Committee identified the shortage and organized a response, it was 4 months after the critical window. The ships they sent carried the wrong kind of grain for Cathari digestion. The nutrient supplements were calculated for Korathi biology, which was what the committee's standard template was built around, because the committee had always had a human member who caught those kinds of errors before the shipments went out. That member was gone. Thousands of Cathari died that did not have to. The Council issued a formal statement of regret. They formed a new subcommittee to review food aid protocols. The Cathari ambassador, a quiet woman named Delath, sat through the formal session where the statement was read and said nothing. She looked at the empty human chairs. She had met the agricultural officers who used to service her planet. She had known some of them by name. She did not say any of this out loud. She just sat there and looked at the empty chairs. Out in the outer reaches, the piracy situation was becoming serious. For many years, there had been a loose network of pirate operations working the shipping lanes beyond Council jurisdiction. They raided cargo ships, they extorted smaller colonies, they occasionally attacked passenger vessels. The Council had a formal response structure for piracy, peacekeeping fleets that were supposed to patrol the vulnerable areas. But peacekeeping fleets cost money and required political agreement to deploy, which meant they moved slowly and often arrived after the damage was done. What had actually kept piracy at manageable levels for the past 30 years was something the official records barely mentioned. Human naval vessels, operating outside their formal Council mandate, had quietly maintained a presence in the outer reaches. They had not done this under any official order. They had done it because they were there, and because the people being raided were people, and because humans, almost pathologically, could not look at something like that and do nothing. Those vessels were gone now. Within 18 months of the silence, the pirate coalition had grown from a loose and disorganized scattering of raiders into something with actual structure and leadership. They had a name for themselves now, the Outer Chain. They were attacking 4 times as many ships as they had 3 years ago. The Council Peacekeeping Committee met to discuss a formal response. They were still meeting when the Outer Chain hit a Lu passenger transport and took the crew hostage. In the meeting room where the Peacekeeping Committee sat, Pip, the young Lu scientist who had gone back to her homeworld after her time at the Joint Academy, submitted a formal written statement from the Lu delegation. It was 3 sentences long. It said that the Lu people would like to know when the Council intended to actually do something, rather than simply meeting to discuss doing something. The committee formed a subcommittee. But of all the things that broke in the 2nd and 3rd year, the one that scared Vrethka the most was not any of the physical failures. It was not the corridor. It was not the famine. It was not even the pirates. It was the silence between the Solvani and the Drath. The Solvani and the Drath collective had been enemies for longer than either species could accurately remember. The reasons had long since become irrelevant. What remained was a deep cultural bone memory of conflict, of old wounds, of things said and done across centuries that no one had fully forgiven. They had maintained cold peace for 40 years. Not warm, not friendly, but functional, quiet, stable enough to prevent war. Vrethka had always assumed this was simply because both sides were tired. What she did not know, what she discovered in the 3rd year of the silence, when the cold peace began to crack, was that there had been a human diplomat named Elia Vasquez who had spent 40 years of her life building personal relationships with individuals on both sides. Not official relationships, personal ones. She knew people by their names, by their families, by their fears and their hopes. She wrote letters. She arranged private meetings. She remembered birthdays in 14 different calendar systems and acknowledged them every year without being asked. When Elia Vasquez went home, she took 40 years of delicate human work with her, not out of spite, simply because it had lived in her relationships, in her presence, and when she left, it ceased to exist. By the end of the 3rd year, The Sylvani and the Drath were exchanging military buildups along their shared border. The Council dispatched an official mediation team. The mediation team came back with a report describing both sides as uncooperative. Vrethka read the report at her desk late in the night cycle. She poured herself a glass of something strong and drank half of it. Then she sat very still for a while. "How much of this galaxy," she said quietly to the empty room, "were they holding together?" There was no one there to answer. But somewhere deep in the archive levels of the station, Sarath 9 was still working, still reading, and the number he was building in his careful Velkari records was growing larger every day. It was a number that no one on the Council was ready to hear. But they were going to hear it soon. The emergency session was held in a small room. That was the first sign that something was different. The Grand Conclave Hall, with its cloud-high ceiling and color-shifting crystal walls, was where the Council held its public sessions, the loud ones, the performative ones, the ones where delegates made long speeches that were really just designed to sound good to people watching from home. The small room on level 2, with its plain gray walls and a table that seated exactly 9, was where the Council held sessions it did not want anyone to hear about. The 7 most powerful species sent their senior representatives. Sarath 9 came alone, carrying nothing but a small data projector that he set quietly on the table without asking permission. Vrethka sat across from the Korathi High Speaker, a massive, copper-shelled elder named Gothrak, who had been making decisions for the Council for longer than most of the other people in the room had been alive. Pip was not invited. She was Lu, and the Lu were not considered a major power. She found out about the meeting 3 days later from Vrethka, who told her in confidence, and who felt guilty enough about the invitation list that she needed to tell someone. Sarath 9 did not begin with an introduction. He was old enough and senior enough not to bother. He simply turned on the projector, let the blue light fill the center of the table, and began. "I have spent 4 years reviewing the full historical record of human activity within and adjacent to the Council," he said. "I will present what I found. I ask that no one speak until I am finished." No one spoke, partly out of respect for Sarath 9, partly because his voice had a quality that made interruption feel genuinely difficult, quiet, even precise, like something carved rather than spoken. He went back 400 years, before formal Council membership, before humans had even been officially classified as a spacefaring civilization by Council observers. He showed them a navigation chart from that era, a safe route through the Veth Nebula, carefully plotted, annotated in a language that the Council's early translators had initially misidentified as an error. It was not an error. It was early human notation, left on a beacon in open space. No name attached. No request for credit. Just a route and a small message in the margin that translated as, "In case anyone needs this." The Council had used that route for 380 years. He showed them the development record of the Universal Translation Matrix, the software system that allowed every species in the Council to understand each other in real time. It was, without question, the single most important piece of technology in the galaxy's political history. Without it, the Council as it existed could not function. The standard Council education taught that it was a collaborative creation of 7 founding species. Sarath 9 pulled up the original development logs, which were detailed, boring, and almost never read. He highlighted the name that appeared on 63% of the primary code architecture entries. He highlighted the names that appeared on the accessibility protocols, the work that made the system function for species with different sensory systems, different cognitive speeds, different language structures. All of it human. The 7 founding species had contributed, but in the way that people contribute to a group project when one member is carrying most of the weight. He showed them the Shriven Plague. 212 years ago, a disease had appeared in the outer systems. It was aggressive, fast-moving, and early models predicted it would reach extinction-level scale within a decade if unchecked. The Council had formed a joint medical task force. The task force had produced 3 reports and 2 frameworks for action before the plague was, quietly and without ceremony, brought under control. The official history credited the task force. Sarath 9 showed them the actual containment records. Human medical teams, working independently of the official task force because the task force was moving too slowly, had identified the transmission vector, developed a working quarantine protocol, and implemented it across 14 systems before the task force had finished its second report. They had then handed their findings to the task force and allowed the task force to publish the results. They allowed others to take credit, Sarath 9 said. He said it the way someone states a fact about weather, flat, accurate, without visible emotion. Then he showed them the numbers. He put a single chart on the projector. It was simple. It showed the population breakdown of the galaxy's sapient species. Human beings, it showed, made up approximately 4% of the total. The next slide showed the breakdown of cross-species humanitarian missions by species participation over the past century. Human beings, it showed, had staffed 31% of all such missions. The room was quiet. He showed them the peacekeeping numbers. Humans had served in voluntary peacekeeping roles at a rate 9 times higher than the next most active species. He showed them the patent and open research database, a record of every scientific development shared freely across the Council without licensing or trade conditions. Human contributions outnumbered the next 5 species combined. He showed them the diplomatic footnotes, dozens of peace agreements, trade deals, and conflict resolutions, each one with a human name buried somewhere in the back pages, not in the headlines, not in the credits, in the appendices, the acknowledgement sections, the supporting parties lists. 40 years of Elia Vasquez's work reduced to a supporting party mention. Gothrak, the Korathi High Speaker, had not moved during any of this. His compound eyes were fixed on the projector. When Sarath 9 paused, Gothrak made a sound deep in his shell. It was a Korathi sound that did not translate well but meant something close to the feeling of stepping on something solid and finding it hollow. Why were they never formally recognized? Gothrak asked. Because no one proposed it, Sarath 9 said. And no one proposed it because everyone assumed they knew how valued they were. We assumed that they could see what we saw, that they were important, that their work mattered. We did not consider that from where they stood, what they saw was that their work was taken, their names were moved to footnotes, their concerns were overridden, and their protests were described as emotional and tiresome. The Solvani representative, a severe woman named Curator Ashan, folded 2 of her 4 arms tightly across her chest. Are you saying they left because we never thanked them? I am saying it is more complicated than that, Sarath 9 replied. But I am also saying that it is not more complicated than that. He put the final slide on the projector. It was a star map of the galaxy. Every active conflict zone was marked in red. Every ongoing humanitarian crisis was marked in orange. Every infrastructure failure was marked in yellow. The map was full of color. It looked, to Vrethka's eyes, like something that was bleeding in several places at once. Then Sarath 9 overlaid a second map, this one showing the density of human activity and presence in those same regions as they had existed 4 years ago, before the silence. The correlation was almost perfect. Everywhere humans had been present, the current map was dark. Everywhere the current map was red, or orange, or yellow, humans had not been there, or had recently left. No one in the room spoke for a long time. It was Vrethka who finally said something. Her voice was lower than usual, quieter. She did not sound like a senior ambassador. She sounded like someone trying to understand something that was simple and terrible at the same time. They were filling the gaps, she said. Every gap. All the things we never voted to do, all the problems we debated too long, all the crises we addressed too slowly, they were just going and doing it, while we were in the hall arguing. Yes, said Sarath 9. And now they're gone, she said. Yes, said Sorath 9 again. Gothrak leaned back in his seat. His shell made a low sound. And the things they were filling the gaps in, they are now the gaps. Sorath 9 turned off the projector. The blue light faded. The room returned to its plain gray walls and its plain gray silence. There is one more thing, he said. He said it carefully, the way someone places something fragile on a hard surface. In my review of human communication and behavioral records across the past 50 years, I found no evidence of resentment in their departure, no anger in their final communications, no bitterness in the way they left their spaces cleaned, organized, undamaged. He paused. What I found instead was something I found more troubling. In several personal logs and community discussions from the years before the silence, the most common sentiment expressed was not anger, it was exhaustion. And underneath the exhaustion, hope. Hope that someone would notice. Hope that someone would ask them to stay. Hope that the council would one day say, clearly and formally, "We see what you do. We are glad you are here." He picked up his data projector from the table. No one said it, he said, and so they stopped waiting for someone to say it and they left. He walked to the door, then he stopped. We assumed they knew, he said, without turning around. We did not consider that they might have simply been waiting to be asked. Then he left. The 7 representatives of the most powerful species in the galaxy sat in a small gray room with a plain gray table and said nothing at all for a very long time. Some of them looked at the wall. Some of them looked at the table. Vrethka looked at her hands. Outside the station, across the shipping lanes and the drift of stars and the slow degrading relay stations of the Myerden corridor, the galaxy continued to show its cracks. And somewhere far beyond the reach of anyone in that room, something new was being built by people who had stopped waiting to be valued and decided to simply start over. It took the council 6 months of internal debate to agree to send a delegation. 6 months, while the Myerden corridor continued to degrade, while the outer chain pirates expanded their territory in the outer reaches, while the Sylvani and the Drath moved more ships to their shared border and exchanged diplomatic messages that were becoming shorter and colder with every passing week, while the Kethari buried their dead and replanted their fields and waited for relief ships that arrived wrong and late. 6 months of asking the same questions in circles. Who would lead the delegation? What authority would they carry? What would they offer? And most importantly, would reaching out to humanity look like weakness? It was that last question that took the longest to move past. The Korathi bloc in particular spent considerable energy arguing that sending a formal delegation was an act of submission. Gothrak, to his credit, was not among them. He had not spoken much in council sessions since the small gray room meeting. But when the debate about whether seeking out humanity was a show of weakness reached its peak, he stood up and said simply, "We are already weak. The question is whether we are also foolish." The delegation was 3 people. Sorath 9, because he knew the history better than anyone alive, and because the Velkari carried a kind of moral authority that other species respected even when they didn't particularly want to. Vrethka, because she asked to go, and because Sorath 9 supported her request in writing, and because the council owed her something for reasons they couldn't quite put into words but felt nonetheless. She had been paying attention when others hadn't. She had asked the hard questions first. And Pip. Pip's inclusion was, by council political standards, unusual. She was Lu. The Lu were not a major power. She had no formal senior rank within the diplomatic structure. When her name was proposed by Sorath 9, Gothrak asked why. Sorath 9 said that Pip had spent 6 years studying alongside humans at a joint academy, that she had friends among them, real ones. That in a conversation which would require the rebuilding of trust, having someone present who had actually been trusted by humans might matter more than any formal diplomatic credential. No one had a strong counterargument to that. Pip was added to the delegation. They traveled in a single vessel, a small, unarmed diplomatic ship, because Soreth 9 had quietly insisted that going unarmed was important, not as a gesture of vulnerability, but as a gesture of sincerity. You don't bring weapons to an apology. The journey took 3 weeks through the outer shipping lanes, then another week beyond the boundary of Council-registered space into the Fringe. The Fringe was a region the Council had always treated as a kind of afterthought, too far out to be worth full attention, too scattered with small colonies and minor systems to fit neatly into the Council's administrative frameworks. It was the kind of place that fell through the gaps. It was, Vrethka realized as they traveled deeper into it, exactly the kind of place where humans would have felt at home. The first sign that something had changed came 3 days into the Fringe. They passed a small colony world that did not appear in the Council's charts. It was listed in old records as an uninhabited system with minimal resources. On their sensors, it was clearly inhabited, not just by a small struggling outpost, but by a functioning colony with active energy signatures, agricultural patterns visible from orbit, and communication infrastructure that spoke in a protocol they didn't immediately recognize. Pip recognized it. "That's a human communication framework," she said, leaning toward the sensor display. "Modified. It's been adapted for multi-species use." Vrethka looked at her. Multi-species. Pip ran the analysis. The colony below held at least 4 distinct biological signatures. "That's not a human colony," she said slowly. "That's a mixed colony, at least 4 species, maybe more." They did not stop. They kept moving. But they passed 3 more such worlds before they reached the coordinates they had been quietly given by one of the few human contacts who had agreed to communicate with them. Everyone showed the same pattern, inhabited, organized, multi-species, and built on infrastructure that bore the marks of human design. What they found at the coordinates stopped all 3 of them into complete silence. It was not a city, it was not a space station, it was a civilization. Hearthpace, as it would later come to be formally known, was spread across 37 star systems connected by hyperspace lanes that were better maintained than anything in the Myrdin corridor had been in a decade. The central hub was a station 3 times the size of Nexus Station Aurelian, but built differently: lower ceilings, warmer lighting, spaces that felt like they were designed for people to actually live in rather than simply pass through. There were gardens inside it. Actual gardens with soil and growing things, because humans, apparently, believed that living spaces should have growing things in them. The population was astonishing. Humans, yes, millions of them from every background and culture and corner of their homeworld, but also Cathari refugees, several 100,000 of them, resettled after the famine, alive because the humans had been there while the Council was still forming its subcommittees. Myrdin workers and engineers, who had followed the humans out to the Fringe because the work was steady and fair. 3 species the Council had delisted as protected, small, quiet peoples who had simply needed somewhere to be safe, and had found it here. A small but active Lu community, young scientists and researchers who had come to work alongside humans after hearing that the research environment in Hearthpace operated on a principle of open collaboration and shared credit. Shared credit. Pip read that in the official Hearthpace research charter while they waited in the receiving area of the central hub for their meeting. The charter was posted openly on a public information board near the entrance, the way someone posts the rules of a house when they want visitors to understand clearly how things work here. Point 7 of the charter said, "All contributors to any research project shall be named fully and accurately in the public record. No contribution shall be reduced to a footnote, and no name shall be removed from the record for political or hierarchical reasons." Pip stood in front of that board for a long time. Then she stepped back, sat down on a bench nearby, and put her face in her hands, not from sadness, from the particular feeling that comes when something broken suddenly becomes visible because you see what unbroken looks like. Their host arrived precisely on time. Admiral General Kofi Mensa was not what any of them had expected, though none of them could have said exactly what they had expected. He was a tall man, unhurried in his movements, with the kind of steady presence that comes not from authority but from genuine certainty, from knowing who you are and being comfortable with it. He wore the dark blue of the Hearthpace Compact's diplomatic branch, and he greeted all three of them by name, in their own languages, with their appropriate greeting customs. He offered them tea. Not as a formality, as a genuine offer. He had 3 different types ready, one suited to Velkari preferences, one for Solvani physiology, one for Lu. He had prepared for them. He had paid attention to who they were before they arrived. They sat at a round table, not long and hierarchical like a council table, round. "How is the council?" Kofi asked. His voice was pleasant, attentive, and carried the precise quality of warmth that Vrethka recognized as the same warmth that Elia Vasquez had always had in negotiations, genuine, but also very, very intentional. Vrethka looked at him carefully. "The council is struggling," she said. She had decided before this meeting to be honest. It had not been an easy decision, but Sarath 9 had told her it was the only one worth making. Kofi nodded slowly. He did not say "I know." He did not say "good." He simply nodded and waited. "We came because we want to understand what happened," Vrethka continued, "and because we would like to formally ask, whether there is any possibility of dialogue about the future, about returning." Kofi was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands once slowly, looking at the table. Then he looked back up at her. "Can I show you something first?" he said. He took them through the station. Not a formal tour, a walk. He showed them the hospital wing staffed jointly by human and Cathari doctors, who had apparently developed a new approach to cross-species medicine over the past 4 years that the Council's medical board didn't know existed. He showed them the engineering bay where the Myerton corridor problem had been solved, theoretically, 6 months ago. A full solution sitting in an open-access database that no one in the Council had thought to look for. He showed them a school where 40 children from 7 different species sat in the same room learning mathematics from a Lu teacher who had previously worked at the Joint Academy. He didn't say anything during this walk. He just showed them. He let them see. When they came back to the round table, Pip's eyes were red. Sarath 9 had that particular stillness he carried when he was doing his deepest thinking. Vrethka's hands were folded tightly in front of her. "You didn't leave in anger," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," said Kofi quietly. "Then why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that was very simple and very honest, the way humans seem to do things when the moment called for it. "Because we finally asked ourselves the question we had been avoiding for 200 years, he said. "Why keep trying to fix something that has already decided what it wants to be, when you have everything you need to build something that wants to be better?" The room was still. Outside the windows of the hub, stars moved slowly past new constellations from this far out. The galaxy looked different from the fringe, older somehow, quieter. "We didn't stop caring about the galaxy," Kofi added. "We never stopped. We just stopped believing that the Council was the only way to show it." Vrethka nodded slowly. Her throat felt tight. "And now we're here," she said, "asking." Kofi picked up his tea. "Yes," he said, "you're asking." He almost smiled. "That's new." The formal summit was held 3 weeks after the first meeting. The Council sent its full inner circle this time. Gothrak came personally, which was unusual. Korathi High speakers rarely traveled. He brought no security team, which was more unusual still. He said it was a practical decision. Those who had read Sarath 9's report understood it as something else. An attempt, however small and quiet, to begin arriving as he should have always arrived, without armor. The meeting room in the Hearthpace hub was the same round table room as before, only larger. The compact had expanded it, smoothly and without comment in the days between the first meeting and this one. There were enough seats for everyone. Every seat was the same height and the same style. There was no elevated position, no seat that was more important than any other by the arrangement of the room. This was, Vrethka noticed immediately, not an accident. Kofi Mensah sat across from Gothrak. He had brought 3 colleagues with him, a Kethari woman named Sel, who served as Hearthpace's head of humanitarian affairs, a quiet human engineer named Daniel Akafer, who had led the infrastructure rebuilding across the Compact's systems, and a young Myerden man named Tessavath, who managed the Compact's diplomatic training program. They were not the most senior people in Hearthspace by title, but Kofi had chosen them deliberately, for the same reason Sarath 9 had chosen Pip for the delegation, not because of rank, but because of what they represented. Gothrak opened the session. He was old and he was practical, and whatever else he was, he had not risen to lead the Korathi by being unable to read a situation clearly. He looked at Kofi and he said, without any diplomatic wrapping, "The Council would like you to return. We are prepared to offer full recognition, permanent senior seats on the Council floor, and a formal written acknowledgement of human contributions to the Council's history." He paused. "We are also prepared to restore full protected status to any species currently residing within the Hearthspace Compact that wishes to rejoin the Council's welfare framework." It was a significant offer, more than the Council had ever formally given to any species in its history. The room was quiet after he said it, and in that quiet Vrethka thought she could feel everyone measuring the weight of the offer from both sides of the table. Kofi listened to all of it without interrupting. When Gothrak finished, Kofi was quiet for a moment. Then he placed both hands flat on the table in a human gesture that the Velkari records identified as a signal of careful honesty, not aggression, not submission, just clarity. "Thank you," Kofi said. "Those are serious offers, and I want you to know that we hear the weight behind them. It is not nothing for the Korathi High Speaker to travel in person. It is not nothing to put acknowledgement in writing. We understand that." He reached to his side and picked up a document. It was not on a data screen. It was printed on actual paper, a material so old-fashioned in a galactic context that half the room's occupants registered it with visible surprise. Paper meant something to humans that screens did not. It meant permanence. It meant that they had thought about this long enough to put it somewhere that could not be easily deleted. He placed it in the center of the table. "This is our response," he said. For a moment no one moved. Then Gothrak reached out and took it. He read it slowly. His compound eyes moved across the pages without expression. When he finished, he passed it to his senior aide without a word. It moved around the table from there, read in silence by everyone present. Pip had already seen it. Sarath 9 had shared it with her the night before, after Kofi had quietly sent it to the delegation so they would not be surprised in the meeting. She had read it sitting on a bench in one of the station's garden corridors, a small loo candle burning beside her because she liked candlelight when she was thinking hard about something important. The document was not a list of demands. That was the first thing it was not. There was nothing in it that said, "Give us this or we will not return." There was no ultimatum. There was no anger. There was also, very clearly, no softening of what it said. It was a framework, detailed, thorough, carefully written, the kind of document that took years of thought and not a few nights of honest argument to produce. It described what the Hearthspace Compact required the Galaxy Council to become if any kind of meaningful cooperation was to take place, not what it required the Council to give humanity. What it required the Council to become. Protected status for small species, not as a favor, not as a welfare provision that could be quietly removed when it became politically inconvenient, but as a codified and enforceable right written into the Council's foundational charter, not removable by simple majority vote, removable only by unanimous agreement and independent review. Transparent humanitarian resource allocation. Every mission, every aid shipment, every peacekeeping deployment, its decision-making process open to full public record. No more subcommittees that formed subcommittees. No more relief ships with the wrong nutrient compositions because no one on the committee had checked. Accountability, built into the system at a structural level rather than applied after the damage was done. An end to border militarization as a default response to political tension. Not an end to military capacity. The document was careful and honest about that, but a formal requirement that militarization be a last resort rather than a first move, with independent review of any significant military expansion before it could proceed. And at the end of the document, in a section that Vrethka had to read twice before she fully absorbed it, a requirement that had no political precedent in Council history. A formal acknowledgement, not a press release, not a diplomatic statement, but a permanent entry in the galactic public record of the contributions of every species, every individual, every person whose work had been reduced to a footnote, an appendix mention, a supporting party credit. Not just humans, every species that had ever worked without recognition in service of the galaxy's well-being, every name that had been moved to the back pages. Every Elia Vasquez who had spent a lifetime building something and been given a footnote for it. A reckoning, but not a punishment. A record, because records mattered. Because you cannot build something honest on a foundation that pretends its own history didn't happen. Gothrak finished reading before most of the others. He set the document down in front of him and sat with it for a long time, looking at the table. His shell made the low sound it had made in the small gray room when Sareth 9 had shown him the maps. The hollow sound. "This will cost us," he said, not to Kofi, to no one specific, just into the room. "Yes," said Kofi simply. "The militarization requirements alone will face enormous opposition from the Korathi bloc and from the Sylvani border councils," Gothrak continued. "Yes," said Kofi again. "The transparency provisions will require restructuring of processes that have existed for 300 years. Yes." Gothrak looked at him. His compound eyes were unreadable as they usually were, but something in the set of his shell, the way he was sitting, was different from how he had arrived. Slightly less closed. "You know all of this," he said. "We know all of this," Kofi confirmed. "We wrote it knowing, we're not asking for easy, we're asking for right." Sel, the Kethari head of humanitarian affairs, spoke for the first time since the session began. Her voice was steady. "My people buried thousands in the third year of the silence," she said. "Not because of malice, because of carelessness, because no one in the council room ever had to look at the people who died from carelessness. The transparency requirements exist so that someone somewhere always has to look." The room was quiet for a long moment. It was the Sylvani curator Ashan who asked the next question. She was looking at the document, not at Kofi, when she asked it. "If the council agrees to this framework, if we genuinely commit to it, not as a performance but as a real structural change, what then? Do you return to the council?" Kofi was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that was not quite the answer she expected. "The Hearthpace Compact is not dissolving," he said. "The species here built something. They built it together and it belongs to them and it works. We will not undo what people made because an old institution has remembered to be better." He paused. "But cooperation is possible. Partnership is possible. If the council becomes what this document asks it to become, we would have reason to work together. Real reason. Not out of obligation. Not because we have nowhere else to be. But because the work would be worth doing together." He let that sit. "That is the difference," he said quietly. "We are not asking to come home. We are asking whether a home worth sharing is something you are willing to build." Gothrak picked up the document again. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he passed it to his aide and said something in Korathi that the translation system rendered as, "Prepare copies for full council distribution." The session continued for 3 more hours. Details were discussed, timelines were proposed, concerns were raised and considered. It was the most substantive conversation the delegation had been part of in their combined careers, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Difficult and honest in equal measure, which was something the council had not quite managed before. When it ended, Pip found herself walking alone through the garden corridors of the hub while the senior delegates gathered for a formal close of session. The gardens were full of plants she did not recognize, growing in the low-gravity conditions of the station, their leaves turned toward banks of soft, warm light. A few other people moved through the corridor, humans, a Kethari child holding someone's hand, a Myerden woman reading something on a small screen. She passed an open doorway and looked through it, and inside she saw someone she recognized. Dr. Amara Osai was sitting on a low bench near a raised planter, her hands in a small container of dark soil. She was an older woman, deliberate in her movements, and she was pressing a small seedling carefully into the earth. She was one of the Hearthpace Compact's chief medical architects, the person who had led the development of the cross-species medical program in the hospital wing. Pip had seen her name on 3 different research papers in the past 2 days. Pip stopped in the doorway. Amara looked up, recognized her from the earlier tour, and nodded. "Pip, yes," she said, "the Lu scientist." "Yes," said Pip. She hesitated, then asked what she had been wanting to ask someone for 3 days. "Do you think they'll actually change? The council? Do you think this time it will be real?" Amara was quiet for a moment. She pressed the soil gently around the seedling's base. She looked at it with the particular kind of attention that doctors and farmers both develop, patient, observant, genuinely interested in whether something small will grow. "I don't know," she said, and she said it without pretending otherwise, which was its own kind of answer. She looked up at Pip. "But they came," she said. "They traveled all the way out here without weapons, and they sat at a round table and they listened. That's not nothing." She looked back at the seedling. "And humans have always been patient with things worth growing." Pip stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Outside the station's wide observation windows, the stars of the fringe turned slowly, old and bright, and completely indifferent to the small, stubborn, fragile things that lived among them and kept trying. Then she smiled, just slightly, and walked on. Behind her, in the garden, Amara Osai pressed another seedling into the soil. And in the meeting rooms and corridors, and around the round table where everyone's chair was the same height, the slow and difficult and necessary work of becoming something better had already begun. They never left in anger. They left in grief, and they used that grief to build something worth coming back to. The price the council faced was not punishment. It was a mirror. And the most terrifying thing about a mirror is that it shows you exactly who you chose to be and leaves the next choice entirely up to you.